Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have a fantastic and incredible episode for you guys, just like always, but I just wanted to make sure at the beginning that you would know that. Today, we are going to have all Cotton Elite questions once again, because I got two questions about the topic I was going to discuss no matter what, and that is the Baltimore Bridge collapse, American decline, what that all means. So I'm going to be discussing that. I do have one point to note of a new thing we're going to be doing on Highly Respected is that this week we are going to be introducing the mailbag episode. And the mailbag episode is going to be found exclusively on Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highly-respected.com. It is going to be paywall because I'm trying to create more content for people, and most of the listeners who submit the questions in would be able to listen to their questions answered. I'm doing this because I'm getting so many fantastic questions from the Cotton Elite that I'm having to split them off because there's a lot of questions I want to devote a little bit more time than I have on the normal episode, and that will give us time. So think of it like a second IQ supplement that we're going to be doing every week. So we should be having 3 podcast episodes per week. The mailbag may not be every week, depending on the volume of questions we're getting. We're getting so many questions from the Cotton Elite that I think we're going to have it for most weeks, but maybe there will be a few weeks that it's not there. But it should be there for most weeks, just like there is for an IQ supplement and the regular Highly Respected episode. So we're going to still answer questions for the normal Highly Respected episode every week, but for about half the questions, they're going to be answered in the mailbag episode. So that should be good. So tune in for that. So now I'm going to have to give my general pitch on the Cotton Elite. For those, I've been talking about all the power and greatness that they're getting. Now, if you too can ask me questions or suggest guests and topics for the show, if you sign up for the Highly Respected Cotton Elite option at Highly Respected's Substack, and that's at highly-respected.com, and make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements there. So we have 2 questions about the Baltimore Bridge collapse. One's from K-Max. K-Max asks, with the Baltimore Bridge collapse, there was an online fervor over DEI and the Baltimore leadership. Would a good anti-woke strategy be to point towards this incompetence? The more we hire on race and not merit, expect more bridges collapse. Also pointing out this got quite a reaction on Black Twitter. Your thoughts on the bridge collapse, Scott? And the tweet he's referring to is there's an account that actually, this is funny. A bunch of people are saying that this is Baltimore's DEI mayor commenting on the collapsed Francis Scott Key Bridge. And people are noting that it sounded like it was like a football player after a game where he's like, we lost, but we put all our heart into it. And it was a very odd statement coming from the mayor, from the leadership. And the governor of Maryland is black as well. So that's from K-Max. And Dollar Bill also asked, he has 2 questions, but we'll ask. The first question deals with the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Concerning the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, will its reconstruction be hampered by the fact that Baltimore is one of the most magical cities in America? Construction workers could balk at working on it over concerns about being shot, robbed, or even sexually harassed by Charm City blacks on the download. I don't know. Well, I don't know about that, but particular one, but they could have worries about that. So I'll go into these questions and my general thoughts on the bridge collapse. So the one thing to note is that pretty much everyone except for the harbor pilots were non-white and foreigners. The crew itself was all Indian. Now the captain, different from the pilots, was apparently Ukrainian. It's hard to get the full information about this because all you're seeing is people on Twitter and sending screenshots and stuff. It hasn't really been confirmed by news outlets. It's hard to get your own information. It's generally clear that this was an all-Indian crew with maybe the exception of the captain, and the captain was allegedly Ukrainian. Some people are saying that it was a Ukrainian attack, a Russian attack. I don't know. But the captain was not American. That's clear. The harbor pilots were, but apparently the main harbor pilot of it was a woman who was touted as like, oh, look at how awesome this is as a female pilot. Now, all this is not 100% confirmed. This is just going off on the information I'm receiving. They were saying the harbor pilots were locally trained, were Baltimore pilots, and thus, I don't think that's a field that's very magical based on the amount of skill it has. And so it's likely that they were white. But it wasn't really the pilot's fault. It was failure on the ship's part, which, power went out, which would have been a result of the crew that they hadn't been maintaining proper maintenance of the ship. And then all the workers who were on the bridge or people on the bridge were all migrants, all Hispanic migrants. I'm sure some of them were illegal as well. It's hard. That's also hard to determine. But everyone who died in the bridge collapse was a Hispanic migrant. And they're from all over Central America. And so it's very funny that this is an incident. I had a tweet which said, massive ship collides into, this major bridge in one of America's oldest port cities, one of America's oldest cities in general. It's a major transportation hub for America, and no Americans are involved in the incident. And everyone tried to fact check. It's like the harbor pilots were American, and it's like, okay, don't ruin my joke. But it is something saying. I mean, this happened in the dead hours of night. This happened in like 1:30 or something. It's not likely you're going to see that many Americans working at that time, working those graveyard shifts. But even if it was like a normal time of day, it probably, outside of the drivers, which they had fewer drivers on the bridge because of how late it was. Most of the workers were going to be migrants. It is very much, it indicates like America is like level that it is now, where much of our menial labor in this country, much of our blue collar labor is done by people of migrant backgrounds. And this isn't to celebrate that. It's just to say how absurd that is, that our situation is that we have in this country. And the fact that so many of this is a massive dependence on foreign labor. Foreign laborers make up over 20% of the labor population in America. Most of them are not working white collar jobs, with the exception of H-1Bs and other things. It's primarily blue collar menial labor. And if you add in blacks in there, I would probably say half, maybe close to half of blue collar jobs in America are worked by non-whites, both migrants and blacks. Now, that's something that has to be kept in mind when all these people talk about it, is like the working class, and it's always seen as a type of white working class. And the whites definitely dominate the skill trades. The trades that everyone on Twitter is always demanding people go in, whether it's welders, plumbers, HVAC repairmen, that type of stuff is still overwhelmingly white, and all these people obviously vote Trump. I remember seeing one graphic, I think it was about donations given by professions, and when it was like HVAC repairmen, it was like over 90% if they donated to a political campaign was to Trump in 2020. And that's an overwhelmingly red profession, Republican profession. But among the less skilled trades are among construction, among people working at factory plants, especially these chicken factories. It is a very non-white workforce there. And this comes into play and one thing I have to point out is that I don't think anybody of us would think this is a great thing, or would say that this is why we need more migrants, because there comes a whole lot of other problems with the migrants. Is that what we're having now with the open borders is that most of these people are coming here over the borders now are not working. They're just coming to live off welfare and to panhandle. They are not coming to build bridges or anything. And a country itself, it's not good to have this type of other caste that does this menial labor. And it's almost a serf caste, which some people were pointing out because there was these libertarians who were like, migrants do the jobs that Americans are too lazy to do. They're up late at night keeping our country afloat. And it was very much this slave labor mentality that they have. And I don't think that's really good for a democracy or a republic to have that. And there's all these concerns, when we did have slavery, that we were having this type of permanent caste system, and we're now having that with migrants as well. And I don't think that's quite healthy for our body politic. And then this is like a caste that doesn't have quite the loyalty to America. It's just here to make a paycheck. And then we're probably in the future going to be increasingly reliant on this caste to supply us with soldiers. But it's something to become aware when it comes to other types of labor. Now, with a bridge, you do need humans working on that bridge. We haven't gotten there where it's robots. But when it comes to factory plants and those types of things, people have this impression, because there's this battle, I think, in Nebraska, where this town is trying to keep out illegal migrants from its locality, and the corporations there that have factories are like upset. They're like, we need the illegal migrants to work these jobs. Now, these companies could very well just invest heavily in automation and solve their problem completely. They wouldn't need hardly any illegals if they just invested in automation. And this has happened before, because some factories have tried to move to areas that are largely white, like in Appalachia, and they felt that we can give these people jobs. Then they figure out that there's not enough people there to work these jobs, or they're just not going to work these jobs. So then they just invest in automation, and they work fine without, that major boost to cost or anything of that sort. And automation is really the key, as the real solution to all these problems with the labor market. With automation, clearly you don't need as many migrants. You don't need migrant labor, and we can even bring back bring back factories from overseas and have robots do a lot of this work. And that's just better. And some people there's some people on the right who are very anti-automation. They're like, oh no, robots can't take over this stuff. And it's like, just pay people higher wages. The fact is, that argument was true 80s, 90s, and likely 2000s. Most of our two big outsourcing pushes are where we pushed our factories overseas. Was the first big push was in the 80s, early 80s. Then the second big push was in the early 2000s. So 20 years ago, we actually did have people to do these jobs. A lot of those people are no longer with us, are completely out of the labor market, or switch jobs. There's not this huge reservoir of white working class people that are just ready to work these menial labor jobs. Even the ones who are blue collar, they've generally gotten a skilled trade, which is much better in terms of pay, and even people prefer that type of job rather than working in a factory. Even just for me, I'd much rather be a plumber than working in a factory. And that's most people's impression of these types of work. I mean, like when it comes to factory work and like fruit picking and stuff, and fruit picking, whites have not done that work unless they were sharecroppers or like that. Like it was really at the bottom, and people were like, oh, we could get whites to work these jobs if they just pay a higher wage. It's like, you can't get that. That's like, fruit picking is the most demeaning job available. And we've been using migrants or other type of labor for that type of work for a long time in America. It's not about wages. It's that people don't want to work these jobs. We can even have that with trucking. Trucking, there's been a massive shortage of truckers for years. Truckers pay very well. If you ever drive on the interstate, you can see these guys. It's like, we will pay $40 an hour starting off, or a very good wage that starting off with the amount of hours you're working, you're going to be making a middle class income, or like 60, 70K just starting off. And depending on where you live, that's a good income. And they keep raising the rates to paid truckers, but they can't find enough people. That's why a lot of truckers are now immigrants. They're coming from in Canada, it's really bad because they've talked about the trucker protests, but then they pulled out these percentages of how many of the truckers are actually South Asian in Canada. It's a lot of Sikhs, and that's even here in America. They can't find enough Americans to do these jobs for various reasons. People don't want to, be gone away from their family and their home for, many days of the week. It's a demanding job, and they'd rather do something else. But it pays very well. And so it's the same with the factory. It's like they could offer, incredible pay, but it wouldn't bring in anybody here, and then it would just increase food prices and other things that we need. So it's the real solution is automation, not to have migrants. Obviously, you're introducing a problem into the country, and then eventually these guys are going to automate, and what happens to these migrants? They then join the unemployed, and then they pose more of a drain on our resources and our social services. So it's like, why introduce that into our country? But the Baltimore Bridge and all the people involved just like shows what a lot of the American economy is. We always still imagine the American economy is made up of Americans. And then, people building our bridges, people like working these factories, our ship, our harbor workers and all this stuff. And it's in fact, it's it's like Babylon and a Tower of Babel that's coming in our country. And in Baltimore's case, it kind of makes sense. Do you really want the local Baltimoreans and the majority population of Baltimore maintaining our bridges? I don't think so. Which that's also going to be a problem when they're going to try to rebuild it. Both the questioners, Dollar Bill and K-Max, were asking about the problems that would happen. But yeah, they're gonna. I mean, I don't know how this bridge is gonna. It's gonna take forever to build this bridge, and it's incredibly important to America's economy and infrastructure for this bridge to be there. It's on a major interstate too. We're gonna have a lot of problems with the bridge, and it took several years back in the 70s to build it. Now imagine it in the 2020s trying to build it, and with Baltimore's current leadership being involved in this, and you're just going to have massive problems. I think the last point I want to do on the foreign nature of a lot of the American economy is how this ship just came in and it was manned by an all Indian crew, and likely poor maintenance of the ship and taking care of it resulted in the power failure. When it comes to what caused it, thanks to right-wing Twitter's universal or constant demand for entertainment and fantasy, everyone immediately latched on that this was a direct hit by some secret organization. It was either the deep state or the Chinese. This is a major attack on America. We're already in a war. And people had no information about this. And then they're like, look how the ship intentionally veers into the bridge. If the ship intentionally veered into the bridge and everyone was looking at it, our American government wouldn't be trying to hide it. They would say, who tried to attack us with this ship? They're not going to tolerate a massive hit to our economy just to own the American people. There's always this mentality. It's like they're doing this intentionally to make us starve. Like they want us to starve to death. And it's like, no, they don't. They want us to keep the people complacent. And the way to keep people complacent is ensuring that, everything's going smoothly. Ships are coming in. Traffic is going through. They're not just intentionally trying to they're trying to starve us, which I remember when there was these food plant fires. They're intentionally trying to start a famine. Obviously, that was happening 2 or 3 years ago. We didn't have a famine. Obesity rates have increased since then. But our whole side is just so addicted to trying to get as much engagement as possible. And you get so much false information on Twitter. And if you had just said, I think this is clearly the work of the deep state working with the Chi-Coms and ISIS, you would have gotten 20 likes, and they're like, this is so 20K likes on this thing. But it's not clearly the case. I mean, there's a power failure. I guess the crew, the harbor pilots, they tried to blame the harbor pilots, but the harbor pilots, were not responsible for the power failure. And they tried to beg for tugboats to come and to drop anchor to steer the ship away from the bridge. And it didn't work. It was likely poor maintenance on the ship's part, which was done by the all Indian crew. But you now have to worry about this is that most of these crews or the people working on these ships are coming from not the best parts of the third world. This is ultimate third world job is to be on these ship crews. And a lot of them are less competent than they would have been 20, 30 years ago. And we still have all these embarrassing errors, like the ship that blocked the Suez Canal for, I think that was over a week. And that was a few years ago. So you're going to see more of this type of stupidity on the roll of the ships because the people that they're relying on are just like the bottom caste from India, or I guarantee they're going to start hiring Africans for this stuff. And you're going to see more ridiculous parts of our international economy just like, taking major hits, whether it's a canal being blocked or, a bridge getting knocked down. A lot of this is going to be a result from this dependence on less qualified workers. So this is also a problem not just on an American level, this is also a problem on a global level. And this is going to take this is going to cause problems for the global economy. Now back onto the bridge getting built. Yeah, it's the problems that we were saying, I think as Dollar Bill mentioned, is like these workers being there and, getting shot and harassed by the locals in Baltimore is a very serious concern. And also the locals could be stealing material from the construction site and other things. I mean, you have to remember, when this was built in the 70s, Baltimore was already rough. Okay, Baltimore's been rough it's not a new thing for Baltimore to be a rough city. Even when it was very much whiter, it was considered like a violent city, even in the antebellum and Civil War era. Different types of people, as a lot of Irish immigrants at that time. But it's not as rough as it is now, obviously. But it's been, back in the 70s, it had these problems as well. But it had a very different leadership now, and the leadership is not going to go against the locals. And one thing that you have to keep in mind is that whether they're going to keep the name of the bridge with Francis Scott Key, there's already been calls for it to be renamed. And there's already been a lot of articles like how Francis Scott Key is a racist. And, Baltimore's local black leadership is going to be involved in this whole process. And all it takes is one of those guys to say, we don't want to honor a racist. We want this bridge to be renamed. Now, depending on federal government's role in this, because the federal government is financing this. This isn't coming from, Baltimore and Maryland don't have the money to rebuild this shit. It's being rebuilt by the federal government. And if you have Trump in office, there are going to be ways that you are keeping the bridge name unless you want the money. We're going to cut off the money. So it depends on who's in charge. A Democratic president may agree to it. They could have like the Thurgood Marshall Bridge or the Elijah Cummings Bridge, which is some of the suggestions that they've had, or the Harriet Tubman Bridge. There's a lot there. There is a strong chance that there is a black leader named after it, depending on who's president at that time and how much the local Baltimore leadership is demanding a name change. And Baltimore's leadership is already being great in this episode. The mayor, Brandon Scott, went on Joy Ann Reid's show on MSNBC, which is just a great collaboration. And Joy Ann Reid went off about how migrants build this country. They're keeping this country together. And now they're trying to attack DEI for this. And then Brandon Scott was like, when they talk about me, the DEI mayor, they really just want to use the N-word, but they don't have the courage to say it. And it's like, what? And then there was Bishop Talbot Swan, or whatever his name is, who had this like all these things that you may use for blacks, like thug, affirmative action, DEI. It's like equals N-word, and they don't want to say it. It's just like, what's going on with the black community? They always try to do this. There was a time where they brought on a black lawmaker during the Baltimore riots 9 years ago. It's actually exactly 9 years ago. It happened April 2015. And this guy came on, and people at this time were using thug. They've known, mainstream media's known you're not supposed to use thug anymore, and they were using thugs in these rioters. And so I think somebody, like the interviewer, is like, the thug's rioting. And he's like, and the guy got mad. He's like, don't use thug. Call me and he even said the N-word on live TV. Just call me that magician. Just call me a magician. And it's on live TV. It's like CNN or whatever. And it was a very Keck moment when he did that. But they always do this thing. They're like, oh, whenever you criticize us, they're just wanting to use the N-word against us. And I don't think that's really the case, but even with the people now, when they mean DEI, among conservatives, there's no longer the dog whistle. They believe they don't. When people always say, "Oh, there's a dog whistle here," when they're saying this, conservatives no longer hear the dog whistle. They believe the what they hear is the truth about this. So if you're like, "Oh, this is all DEI," they're like, "Yeah, it's all DEI," and it's like, but when we mean DEI, we mean black people. They're like, "Really? I thought this was all just meaning black people." They don't really make a lot of our white conservatives, they're very earnest and simple and honest people, and they don't really make these deep connections that you have. But that's another topic to do with this. So this is the type of leadership you have in Baltimore and in Maryland. Maryland also has a black governor. So if they can easily raise a fuss to demand a new name change to the bridge. And I think if Biden wins another term, and the bridge is going to take a while. I mean, it would be a miracle if it's completed at the end of whoever's the next term it is, even under Trump. I mean, maybe it could be a great thing that Trump accomplishes. He could say, we rebuilt this bridge before I left office. Maybe that could be a part of his Making America Great Again project. I don't think it will be. Any type of government project takes forever. I mean, remember in the D.C. area, they're adding a new line to the metro, the Silver Line. And even their expansions, it took years to get this shit done. And I can only imagine with the state of Baltimore now that they're going to have to deal with. So the Guatemalans and Hondurans who are likely going to be major part of the workforce rebuilding the bridge are going to be interacting with a lot of magic. So there's so many intersections things involved in the story. You have one, the America's dangerous dependence on migrant labor to do all these jobs. You have the global trade being impacted by maybe not by third worlders. You have Baltimore's magical leadership. You have general government incompetence coming in from the federal government, and how this is essentially the executive branch acting as like, we're going to underwrite anything here. Don't worry about the legislative. It's not even having to worry about the legislative branch here, which we'll get to in a moment. And then you just have Baltimore's crime level that's also could be impacting bridge construction, which I have to talk about that a little bit of a point. There's a little bit of a debate over, no-go zones and Europe, and how like France is now conquered, and people were like saying that's not really true. And then they were showing pictures from Paris and other cities about how much nicer they are to America. And I think one way of comparing this is to look at Sweden compared to the United States. And Sweden has been generating a ton of headlines, a ton of news coverage for like the last 3 years. I think it's even more. I think I remember stuff from like 5 years ago in international news, Associated Press, New York Times, other places have all been covering Sweden's crime wave. And compared to the past, they are having a major crime wave because, their major cities 30 years ago were like quiet suburban neighborhoods practically. There was no real crime. Now they're having like grenade fights and shootouts between these gang members and stuff, and their murder rate is rising. And per capita, they have one of the highest gun homicide. They have the highest gun homicide rate in Europe. I forget if they have the highest homicide per capita in Western Europe. But they have the highest gun homicide. That's also in part because in a lot of these European countries, it's very difficult to obtain a gun. Like in the UK, it's very, very hard for these guys to obtain guns. And sometimes when there's a gun homicide, it's like a homemade gun that they did. There was like an assassination attempt. There was there was an assassination of a politician. I think this was right before Brexit, where some guy with a homemade weapon, it was like very low-tech weapon, used it in assassination. There's one of the Germany, there was an attempted synagogue shooting in Germany where the guy used a homemade weapon. So there's all these, they usually use, guns they made at home. So it's very hard to obtain a gun. Somehow in Sweden, they're have an easier time of obtaining real weapons. And last year they had 121 murders, and there's about 10 million people in Sweden. Just under 10.5 million people. So it's a little bit over one. I'd say like 1.2. I'm not going to, once again, we're not going to do math, but it's a little bit over one. And most of this is limited to the major cities. If you ever read the reports, it's always about Stockholm and Malmo. Now, Malmo, side note, is in Swedish is pronounced because it has an umlaut. It's Malmö, but I prefer, it's America. We're going to call it Malmo. Even on news reports, they call it Malmo. If you ever hear CNN, they're not going to call it Malmö. It's like Gothenburg. Gothenburg, it's like the proper way of pronouncing it. I didn't realize this. They don't pronounce the G. They pronounce the G very differently in Swedish than versus German. Anyway, Gothenburg is like the second biggest city. All the murders are limited to there. But all those cities, I was trying to look for the exact murder rate for these cities. I could not find it. I found one figure for 3.4 for Malmo. And Malmo is a slightly smaller city. It's like 350,000 people. But it's gaining a lot of attention. It's about equal to Stockholm. If you ever read these news reports, they're always talking about Malmo. They don't talk about Gothenburg as much. Gothenburg is the second biggest city. And Stockholm is just under 1 million people. So and there's a couple of other cities where they would have these murders, but they would all have, I would say, probably a murder rate of 5 per 100,000, if that. I would say for Stockholm, it's probably under 5. Malmo, considering how small it is and how many murders and our least media attention, it might be at 5. And everyone has this now imagining of Sweden is that if you go there, you're gonna like a grenade's gonna fall on you, and there's just like gang shootings all the time, and it's like extremely dangerous. But as a murder rate of 5, probably the highest in one of the cities, the highest possible would be 5 per 100,000. That's lower than America's, which America's murder rate is for last year was 5.5, and that's much lower than some of America's cities. Our nation's capital has a murder rate of 40 per 100,000. It had nearly 275 murders, and it's a city somewhat over 600,000. Now, Baltimore's murder rate is even higher. In recent years, it's gotten over 50 per 100,000 in Baltimore. And St. Louis is like over 60 per 100,000. Actually, Jackson won Mississippi almost in 1 year, got nearly 100 per 100,000. So that's how insane of a murder rate. Imagine just nearly 100 per 100,000. And nobody talks about Jackson's murder rate. Nobody talks about any of our cities. Pretty much all of our cities have over 10 per 100,000. And pretty much all of our cities now have a major petty crime problem where they'll tolerate looting, they'll tolerate, open drug use, they'll tolerate aggressive panhandling, and even like minor assaults. This is a major problem, and that's like seen in New York, DC, Philly, Chicago, most of the terrible cities. And this is how a lot of our cities are like, that we've pretty much just given up on our cities. And you have to think it's like, people are saying, well, it's not as bad in Europe, but people in Europe are more up in arms about like the changes that migrants have made that still make their cities much better than any American city and still much safer than any American city. And compare it to American attitudes towards our cities, where even if they're like New York City, where the murder rate isn't that high, it's still like a very dirty city. You're still more likely to suffer minor assaults and the ravages of petty crime. Like, you go to a CVS and everything is behind, a locked counter. This is a type of problem that they don't have to really deal in Europe. But we kind of just accept it. Large part because the people who most care about crime don't live near the crime. They live in the suburbs in rural America, and they don't really have to deal with these problems. While the people who live in these urban areas are just, say, big city life, and this is what's said in New York City, because there was this viral TikTok video where this woman like talked about how she got punched in the face by a black guy, and then all these other women were recounting about how they got punched in the face too by random people in New York City, and all of them were like, well, just living life in New York City, living the dream. And they all we're like, well, this shouldn't be seen as a trend or it should be criminal. And it's just something that happens and you just have to accept it. Which in Europe, if they have like any type of gang murder, they're like, our city is ruined. We have to start deporting migrants. Just a different response that you have there. Maybe it's because a lot of these places, they do have memories of when these cities were were completely, French, Swedish, German, and they had like no problems at all. And now they have some problems, and the people live in these urban areas. Like the normal people still live in these areas. It's just not all, yuppies and those types who are willing to accept this stuff. And they get really upset about these changes to their life. And also, a lot of them are, especially the more working class types, are competing for social services and housing with a lot of the new migrants too, which it's very rare for white Americans to be competing with housing with migrants. I mean, sometimes they'll dump a bunch of refugees in a small town or rural America, but it's not like they're losing their home over this. It's just disrupting their local community. Now, K-Max asked in part of his questions, like, if we hire more on race and diversity standards, will more of this stuff collapse? And that's absolutely true. If we just hire on these standards. But one thing you have to keep in mind with America, even though we do have these diversity standards and quotas, we're still a country that is very much economy uber alles, above all else. This is our number one concern. And we do make some hedging around it with affirmative action and with diversity standards and DEI training and that sort. But we do that with the expectation that it either helps our economy or it does nothing to harm our economy, even though it will do stuff. But we will never try to do anything that will actually destabilize our economy or create major economic changes that we don't want to go on. And we can see this with how Europe is adopting a lot of this climate idiocy that is hurting a lot of the farmers. That's why a lot of these farmers are protesting. That is eroding their energy supplies. We've seen in Europe, where they, trying to move to clean energy and also shutting down the nuclear power plants. And also their total commitment to the Ukraine war, even though they're really suffering extremely negative consequences from it. In Europe, they're willing to engage in a lot of stupidity that's going to hurt their economy if they think there's some grand moral cause for it. In America, we would never do that. We only do things that are very mild, that don't disrupt our economy to a major extent. One exception was the lockdowns, which even with our lockdowns, we never tried to attempt the type of severe lockdowns that Europe was still trying to do and Australia was trying to do in 2021 because we knew it would disrupt our economy too much. We just tried to mandate masks, and we then had really stupid policies for our kids and schools, especially compared to Europe. But, the school policies were not affecting the economy. What would be affecting our economy was forcing businesses to shut down and other measures. We definitely operate on a mentality that our whole country just relies on the economy. Now, granted, every country relies on the economy, but really for America, economic development, economic prosperity are much more central to our identity. It's like everything else doesn't matter besides economic prosperity. That's it. And anything that will get in the way. So seeing what's happening with Germany with their, economic collapse, that they're having virtually no economic growth anymore because of their stupid policies, we would never do that. And our people would rise up, not in a type of revolt, but they would get so pissed if we were having those types of developments within our own country. And a lot of this is helped by how our government is run now. Our government is not run by the people we elect. And this isn't like, it's like Alex Jones is like, we don't have democracy anymore. What we have is a government that's run by the bureaucracy and the judiciary. And what the legislative branch does on the federal level is simply pass temporary budget deals to fund the bureaucracy and appoint people to the judiciary. Now, the executive branch has control over what those two things can do. they can fire people, they can reshape things, they can reform, they can pick the appointments for the judiciary, and they can try to pass policies that can test the waters of the judiciary, whether they allow it or not allow it. They do have a little bit more leeway, but the legislative branch doesn't do shit. And this is supposed to be the people's house. It was supposed to be the most powerful branch of government. It was supposed to be the active factor in determining what the government's like. And it pretty much just doesn't have a role anymore. And this is important when it comes to Baltimore Bridge, is that, let's say the legislative branch wanted to, they would pass, the budget for it would likely have to go through the legislative branch, but of course they would rubber stamp it. But if there was any other type of grand project that the government wanted to do, it would never originate from the legislative branch. It would come from the executive branch. So the executive branch leads on these matters and tells them what to do and what budgets to fund. And all they really can do is just rubber stamp this stuff. Now, they can do bad stuff if there's a majority of Democrats. They're more capable of accomplishing something from the legislative branch than if there's a majority of Republicans, because majority Republicans are a much more divided party, and it's much harder for them to get to agree to things than it is for Democrats. Democrats do march more in lockstep. But it's hard for any party to now have an overwhelming majority to pass their dream legislation. And so with a stalemate in Congress, which effectively nothing gets done, as we've been seeing now. And I have to say, nothing getting done is better than something getting done, because when you have a spirit of bipartisanship, that's when you get amnesties, that's when you get criminal justice reform, that's when you get more support for another stupid foreign war. So it's better if we don't have Congress agreeing to stuff. So you're relying on the bureaucracy and the judiciary to just make decisions. Or really the president, but the bureaucracy can just operate on its own. And we're seeing this now with Biden just like not knowing what's going on with the Pentagon just running itself however it sees fit. I'm sure the intelligence community is doing the same. And they're just doing whatever they want now with no oversight. And when Trump was president, a lot of the bureaucracy was actively working against the president, whether it was the Pentagon, the IC, or the other agencies. They were actively working against the president, and there wasn't much oversight with them. And then the judiciary, if anything passes in this country, whether it's at the state level or federal level or the president, then the judiciary has to review it and give the final approval of whether it's allowed. And so this is that does come into a little bit of a factor with Baltimore. It's a little bit off topic, but it's something I wanted to emphasize because I was tweeting that stuff. And it's the same with the economy. It's, this is it would be a major loss for any country. But this obsession with the economics as primary, the economy as above all else, this is what encourages us to want mass immigration, because instead of viewing long-term about how automation is better, all these companies don't want to spend the extra money now to save themselves money in the future. They just want the cheap foreign labor. This also prevents our country from cracking down on really negative practices, whether it's legalized weed or sports betting, which are very much detrimental to our country, but they make so much money for our country, and I don't know if legalized weed is so much of an economic issue, but that does come into play. Sports betting is a major economic issue because they're making so much money from this industry, and the sports leagues are now seeing massive profits and more interest in their games because of this, thanks to sports betting, that we would never crack down on it because it's causing too much economic prosperity. And for our government, it's it's keeping the people content and complacent, and that's really what we want. And so when we operate a country as our chief unifying factor as the economy, we're incapable of doing grand national projects that maybe don't have an economic purpose or that may hinder the economy, but is better for us in the long term. We instead just try to do everything to save a buck or make a buck. And this is an unfortunate factor in American life now. And there's, unfortunately for a lot of Americans, there's nothing that connects us outside of this pursuit of happiness, so to speak. And you can be a Salvadoran migrant laborer who doesn't speak English, or you can be Indian H-1B worker, or just black mayor of Baltimore. You're all united in the shared purpose of wanting to have a little bit of that share of economic prosperity. Now, some get in the way of that, like the Baltimore's black leadership ensures that they can't have much of an economy because they don't want to crack down on crime. And so there are elements that will do things to go against the economic interests, and generally they're for left-wing idiotic reasons like not wanting to crack down on crime or insisting on racial quotas and all these things. But for most of the country, and especially for white America, the most important thing for them is the economy. And anything that gets in the way of that, they will oppose. And that's why I think that even a lot of these business owners and conservatives who may oppose illegal immigration in the abstract, when it actually comes to their business, they all up in arms. And this was even happening under Trump, is that a lot of these guys who are running small businesses or businesses throughout the country were, wildly protesting Trump's harsh immigration measures because that's their labor force. You can't do this. This is hurting our bottom line. And when the bottom line becomes the chief factor in your country, you have a country that ends up like modern America for all of its problems and its few good things that it has. So there's much more to talk about this topic in the future. But that's all my thoughts on the Baltimore Bridge collapse. I think it really captures America in its current form. And it has so many of the issues of America. The fact that it happened in Baltimore, which is the, real symbol of American decline. The fact that the black leadership of Baltimore is making these ridiculous claims about, any complaints about it is that they're wanting to call them the N-word. And then the fact that like all the laborers on the bridge were, foreign migrant laborers, the fact that this was caused by a ship manned entirely by Indians, there's just so, and then, the mass type of incompetence we have in our workforce and our government is going to keep that this bridge may not take, 10 years. It may take more than 10 years to build. The fact that there's going to be a push to rename this bridge. There is absolutely going to be a push, even though it may be suggested by just a few people on Twitter now. Baltimore and Maryland's leadership are going to be wanting a name change. They don't have to worry about white people who still care about Francis Scott Key anymore. It doesn't matter if he wrote the national anthem. He's a racist. They've already removed public honors for Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Okay, they can obviously remove Francis Scott Key memorials and public honors, and they've even done this to George Washington. So it doesn't matter that he wrote the national anthem. And then you have the precarious nature of a lot of the American economy about how something as stupid as a ship running and colliding into a bridge and collapsing the bridge can cause harm to our economy. And you just have all these factors built up into one story. And so it just all illustrates American decline at multiple levels. And it's something that we're going to witness much more in the future as the quality of our workforce declines, as our ships and our international transportation and trade is more dependent on these third worlders who are maybe not keeping best shape of their ships and other equipment. And we're all subject to these things. It's the same with like the competency crisis that we're going to see with air travel. And these there's been enough stories where there's been near crashes that we're just going to have a domestic air crash. A lot of it's due to how bad the workforce is. They're not keeping best shape of these planes. They're forgetting that there's not a wheel there or that there's bolts missing. And you're obviously just going to have a crash at some point. And this is just what happens in America where we're not producing the same type of people we had before. When it comes to we used to have a huge reserve of white working class to work these jobs. In the 80s and that time, we had a massive surplus of people to work these jobs. Now we don't have the human capital that we once did. And we're now relying, in the same way the Roman Empire was relying on foreigners to staff its military, we're now relying entirely on foreigners to do a lot of this blue-collar labor. And we're eventually going to have to rely on foreigners to join our military as well. So it's all a grim reminder of the country we live in. But we're now going to move on to the rest of the Codfleet questions that we have. I will keep it to I'll answer dollar bills second question that he had, and we'll go to K-Mac's second question. He asked, have you seen the, oh, this is, oh no, it's a different TikTok. He said, have you seen the TikTok video floating around of a liberal woman talking about how she had moved to St. Petersburg, Florida, and wanted to make friends? The group of other women invited her to go have some drinks at a sports bar that would be showing a UFC fight. During the fight, Trump himself appeared, and the bar crowd began chanting USA, and one of the other women said, what can I say? I love the guy. At which point, the libtard woman immediately fled in the Uber back to her place. She describes the experience like it was physically painful, and from her physical expressions, body language, and speaking style, one suspects she thinks of herself as the main character in a sitcom. I have not seen the TikTok video, but yes, there's a lot of people who come into these culture clashes. A lot of liberal people live in bubbles, and they're not aware that there are people that are very different from them who like Trump. And a lot of them had, prior to moving to places like St. Petersburg, Florida, or Nashville, or somewhere like that, or Texas, they had never experienced Trump voters. And then they're trying to make friends, and then they go and have these bizarre instances where they make Trump voters. And it is like, it is a major cultural shock for them. And it's always like happened that, a lot of people live in their own bubbles depending on where they live, and they don't interact with people. I think with conservatives, they always know a few liberals, or they're aware of what liberals are like. A lot of liberals are not aware of what conservatives are like because they don't know any conservative friends. And if they do have a conservative friend, he really tries to hide it. So they don't want to be excluded, because liberals are more likely to exclude conservatives from their social circles than conservatives are with liberals. So they don't experience it. So, yeah, I think it's, I have not seen the TikTok, but I know there's been a lot like that, and it's very indicative of what a lot of liberals are like. So, now we're going to go to K-Max's second question, which we'll bring up here shortly. A lot of good questions today that we have. And, somebody just sent in one right before the buzzer on this. And so K-Max has a question about boycotts. He said, the most successful boycott the right ever pulled off was a Bud Light boycott. Such boycott of Starbucks or Ben & Jerry's ice cream would not work nearly as well due to the types of people who buy this product, so that's issued as a question. Will the key be for the right to focus on products where they are the dominant consumers for boycotts? Online gaming communities, basically products where the right wing are the more dominant consumers. Could you picture another boycott that would work as well as Bud Light did? I think the thing about Bud Light is that it worked is that there's so many other alternatives to purchase. It's not like the NFL. The NFL, there's only one NFL. I mean, you have the XFL, I guess, and Canadian football, but you don't, and you do have college football, but if you want, it's the best product that you have for the sport. It's the only one NFL, and people have long-term appreciation or attachment to the league and to the teams. So there's not really another alternative. With Bud Light, there's thousands of other beers you can drink. So that was why it was easy to pull off, because somebody who's like drinking Bud Light is like, now I'm going to drink Coors Light or Miller Light or Yingling or something else instead. Or for a lot of people, Modelo, which is outside of the U.S. is owned by Anheuser-Busch, but that's another, or the Anheuser-Busch parent company. But that's another topic. So it really has to be where there's another alternative. With Starbucks, there's not really a rival coffee chain. It's like the coffee chain. And it's always been liberal too. Everyone's always known it's been liberal. It's not like a new thing for Starbucks to be liberal. Like people were complaining about it in the 2000s about how liberal it is. And they've been doing idiotic liberal stuff for as long as it's been a national thing. So there's not really a rival coffee company. I mean, you can go to Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, but like among coffee chains, Starbucks generally has the best coffee. I know that might be some people may be getting upset, but like I remember with like Dunkin' Donuts, which also is probably the closest rival as a coffee chain, even though it's primarily for donuts. I never really liked Dunkin' Donuts coffee. You could go to McDonald's and stuff, but none of them have quite the coffee style of Starbucks. And it's also, most of its main consumer base accepts it as a liberal left-wing company. It's the same with Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's has always been liberal. They were attacking George W. Bush when he was president. They've just accepted that. There's other ice cream brands you can consume though. But they do make particularly high quality ice cream that others don't offer, and people just like accept it. So it has to be something like that there's another alternative to it. Like if a detergent company decided to put Black Lives Matter all over their detergent, you could easily just pick another detergent. And it has to be something that's there's an all alternative. And also with Bud Light was specifically geared towards a demographic that was not going to be keen on being seen as the gay beer, as the trans beer. You know, it tries to appeal to a bro demographic. It's not so much a conservative demographic, but a bro demographic. And these guys, you know, like fraternity guys or whatever, they don't want to drink the gay beer. Okay. And once it became associated with the gay beer and it's like, oh, you support trans and stuff, then it became a bad vibe and they wanted to move on to another beer. So that's why Bud Light worked so well. And also it just came at a time where, you know, X had been under Elon, and now it's allowing viral right-wing posts, and there's all these convergence of factors there and the right needed something to, you know, motivate itself and unite itself, and it decided on Bud Light. I always thought it was the level of seriousness that they put on the Bud Light. I always thought was silly, but it did work for a variety of factors, and it could work for, again, a lot of companies are leery about being Bud Lighted. You know, Target, which, you know, the chief alternative to Target is even worse than Target. You know, Walmart does way worse stuff than Target. But the fact is when Target was trying to do this trans stuff last year, and they were worried about getting Bud Light, that they immediately backed off. And most companies, after seeing what happened to Bud Light, do not want to agitate conservatives like they did before. Prior to Bud Light, all these corporations like, how can we provoke and agitate conservatives the most? And once they would agitate conservatives, they would have like a Twitter account as like, stay mad, losers, and they would have no effect. But after Bud Light, they now worry about this stuff. And so they do have to keep conservative consumers in mind. So that is my answer to that question. We've got one from Kingslander. Kingslander asks, can you give your thoughts on Rupert Murdoch and his media empire? I just finished reading a book on him by Neil Chenoweth, and I think it's underdiscussed in the modern era just how big an impact on creating a media space for the right wing he's been. When do you think he became public enemy number one amongst libs, and do you think him selling off 20th Century Fox to Disney was a missed opportunity for the right to use it to carve out a spot in pop culture? Couple of different things. I would actually, you know, it's not popular to say this, but Rupert Murdoch and his media empire has been mostly positive. Rupert Murdoch himself, there are certainly things to worry about. But the fact that he created a right-wing media space in this country has been something extremely important. If we did not have the right-wing media space of the Rupert Murdoch empire, we would be a far more libtarded country. And yes, even with how cringe Fox News can be, and you know, some of the opinions that Wall Street Journal and New York Post have, it would be much worse without Fox News. And so it's been very important that we have Fox News. Now, Fox News hasn't always been promoting good stuff. It helped get America into war under Bush, but it also helped elect Trump. So in 2016. So, you know, there's a bit of a wash there. And it also encouraged opposition towards Obama. And I think that due to the fact that Obama wanted amnesty, and Fox News was wavered on it. Some hosts were pro-amnesty, you know, like Bill O'Reilly, even though he had railed against amnesty before. The fact that the Fox News media consumer have been trained to think that anything that Obama does is evil made them want to oppose amnesty. And it also helped the amnesty fight in the 2000s. Now, pre-Fox News, let's look at what conservatives were passing. They passed the Amnesty Act of 86. They increased immigration with the 1990 Immigration Act. They then expanded civil rights with the Civil Rights Act of 1991. If we had Fox News back then, we would have probably not had these things happen. But we may have had another stupid war. So you have good and bad that come with it. And if you ever talk with European right-wingers, they always lament that they don't have a Fox News. I think this is and this is a problem in the UK UK has the tabloids, which are all right leaning, but they're not totally like Tory papers. And they'll turn on the Tories at times, and then they'll lament racism in a way that a lot of our papers won't. They're both like, if you read Daily Mail is both more racist and more anti-racist than like the New York Post and like Fox News. It's a bizarre publication, but the tabloids do have a right-wing bent. But it's still not as powerful, and they have a lot more power within their country than our tabloids. But they don't have a Fox News. There have been attempts at it. They have GB News, but I've heard reports that their ratings on GB News are good, but GB News is not nearly at the stature yet of Fox News. And in places like France and Germany, they don't have a Fox News. Now, their people are still rising up against the regime and wanting immigration restriction. And I think that's just because there is a silent majority that's not represented there. In America, we no longer have a silent majority. We have a very vocal minority that's able to stop bad things from happening at the legislative level, thanks to this massive media space we have, and this thanks in large part to Fox News. So I think there's a lot to criticize Fox News on. I mean, if you ever watch the channel, there's a ton of cringe on there. But without Rupert Murdoch and his empire, the situation would be much worse. Because unlike in Europe, we don't have people know that there are problems, and the country will arrest them if they speak out on these problems on social media and other things, which they won't really do here. I mean, obviously there's a few examples here, but nowhere near the level examples in Europe. And Europe actually has official hate speech laws. I mean, look at what happened to Dries van Langenhove, who just for posting some memes in a private chat, he's now going to jail for a year. And look at what's happened to Martin Sellner. It's much worse in Europe. But they still have that silent majority. We no longer have that silent majority. And so it's dependent on these large and powerful media spaces to prevent things from getting worse. And if we didn't have these media spaces, we would just be a much worse country. Now, if it's like a missed opportunity to sell off 20th Century to Fox to Disney, I don't really think so. I think Murdoch wanted to keep the politics out of 20th Century Fox. I mean, he had been running it for years, and it wasn't like a conservative powerhouse what was happening with 20th Century Fox. I think he made his money off it. He is a businessman at heart, or in his primary goal. And he also operates a lot of the tabloids, the British tabloids. I actually forgot to mention that. But he wasn't really using it before, so I don't know if it's quite a missed opportunity. It could be. But one thing we have with the entertainment world is we don't have enough people to actually do this stuff. You can still produce right-wing movies and TV shows like Apocalypto, or pretty much most of Mel Gibson's movies. Lord of the Rings, which was unintentionally right-wing, but obviously just due to the source material was very right-wing. You could have these opportunities, but 20th Century Fox wasn't really doing that even under Murdoch's ownership. So slight missed opportunity, but not much of it. But in conclusion, for all the faults with Rupert Murdoch, and he's always been pro-amnesty, he's always been leery of Trump, and they've always been like huge war hawks and other things. It would be due to the fact he knows he's wanting to cater to his audience and get a bigger audience, and that Fox News is so influential and important. It has made America a lot better than it could be, and it's prevented a lot of worse things that could have happened without that massive media empire. So we do owe Rupert Murdoch a lot. I mean, if we did not have Rupert Murdoch's media empire, we would have not gotten Trump. Now we have a question from Paul, and he asks, do you know what factors are at play in Wisconsin and to a lesser extent Michigan and Pennsylvania that make those states part of the few real swing states left? I think we all know why Arizona and Georgia are swing states now. Also, why from the 90s up until Trump did those states all go for Democrats in the presidential elections? Was the electorate there not interested in or turned off by the pre-Trump Republican Party's focus on religious right issues and seeming libertarian economics, while Trump's charisma, anti-globalist identitarian issues, anti-establishment rhetoric, and trade protectionism switched enough working class white voters cause higher than normal Republican turnout in those states? Or were there other factors? One thing I think that's the key factor in all these states is the decline in union membership. Even though a lot of right wingers have always been like, we need to win over union voters and stuff, when actually you have strong unions in your state because they're putting a ton of money into the coffers of the Democratic Party. They're one of the chief financing sources for the Democratic Party. But when you have a decline in union membership, that means less money is going into their coffers. And also there's fewer people who are under the direct control of the unions to vote in a democratic way. So if you have a strong union, it means more money for Democrats and a stronger institution telling their people to vote for Democrats. And in Wisconsin and Michigan, they passed right to work laws, which really hindered and crippled union activity in those states, and it marked a decline in union membership. So that's one factor. Another thing is that a lot of liberals are leaving those cities because those areas are in decline. Like Milwaukee, Detroit, and this is also even true in Ohio with like Cleveland and those in the cities there. Those are not the cities that are really drawing people in. A lot of those libtards who are living in those cities or in the surrounding areas are now moving to Texas and to Nashville, Atlanta. They're moving to the Sun Belt. They're moving away from those cities. And so what's left behind is maybe the less well off. And also those rural areas, Republicans have flipped so many rural areas and non-college educated whites, is that a lot of the people who are remaining in those states are, their parents and grandparents would have voted Democrat, or they themselves would have voted Democrat maybe when they were, tied to the unions and stuff. But now, due to the switch in the Republican Party and the switch and the dramatic shift in non-college educated white voters under Trump, that those people are voting for Republicans. And a lot of the college educated white voters who would have been more liberal than people in southern suburbs, they've moved elsewhere. And so that's been some of the factors with that. I'd say 3: decline in unions in those states and just decline in unions in general. The switch of non-college educated whites across the board to voting Republican, which those states have a lot of, and those are the people who are most likely to stay in those states, while the college educated whites who are leaning more Democrat have moved elsewhere. So I would say those are some of the 3 factors that have happened under Trump. It could be appeals too. I mean, yeah, the Midwest has never been a real bedrock of social conservatism like the Sun Belt has. And a 4th factor is that those states are not, Michigan is. Those states are not getting as many immigrants as elsewhere, and they're still pretty white states. Wisconsin is 80% non-Hispanic white. Michigan is 74% non-Hispanic white. Pennsylvania has to be less. I need to look up Pennsylvania's. Hold on, give me a second. Actually, Pennsylvania is just about as white as Michigan. It's just under 75% white, non-Hispanic white. So those are states. So that's something to just keep in mind, is that they're still pretty white states. The whites there are different from like New England whites, who are just don't experience any diversity or anything. Like these people in Wisconsin and Michigan, they're well aware of what's happened in Milwaukee and Detroit and Philadelphia and some of these other, they have a lot more diversity than Vermont and Maine. And with that experience of diversity, they're more likely to vote Republican. And there's also towns like Scranton and elsewhere that are also having a massive immigration flux. So, and obviously in Michigan, there's now a bunch of places that have a huge Muslim population. So with those factors, they're more likely to become battlegrounds. But so if I had to locate to, actually I would disagree. Hold on, let me rephrase this. I would say the 4 factors are declining unions, 2, the switch of the non-college educated white voters to overwhelmingly being Republican, 3, the migration of a lot of these college educated whites that are moving liberal or were already liberal from those states, and the whites who are staying are more likely to be conservative, and 4 is that the states have remained very white compared to the rest of the country. The country is 57% white. And both these states are nearly 70, and all three of these states are nearly 75% white. And unlike in whiter states in New England, they experience enough diversity to make them want to vote Republican. So I had talked about this last week about how the factor of if a state experiences diversity, like with New England, or unlike New England, they're more likely to vote Republican, as we can see in the Deep South, where there's only a thin white majority in Mississippi, yet it's like the most conservative state. So, and even a state like Texas, where it's not even a white majority or white plurality anymore, it's still a pretty conservative state. So we've got two more questions. For those who don't get their questions asked, I think I told a lot of you guys that you would have it for the mailbag. If you did not get a response from me that it's for the mailbag, just hit an email back and we'll confirm it. So we have two more questions coming up. Well, three, it's like one is just an acknowledgement of a question, but I talked to this person, but I'll just give the story about that. This is from Chud. He asks, there's an escalating trend where new holidays and months are constantly being created to recognize obscure groups and people. Confusingly, in addition to Easter, yesterday was both Transgender and Cesar Chavez Day. While those are not official federal holidays, it's still very annoying, not to mention cringe, to have to constantly hear about these topics from politicians who mainly use them as a virtue signaling opportunity or a device to force everyone to say good things about figures who didn't exactly have a positive impact on the world. Just look at the list of proposed and even existing federal holidays. Basically, all of them are cringe exaltations of beloved progressive icons. And one of them, only ones that is not cringe, Columbus Day, is constantly under attack. Who knows how long that will last? My question is, should the next Trump administration or otherwise next base government get ahead of the curve on this and start declaring and recognizing some new holidays? Which holidays or people would you like to see recognized? Would you suggest removing or renaming any existing ones? Well, it depends on whether it's a federal holiday or just like a Transgender Visibility Day. There's just days you should remove, like Transgender Visibility Day, Cesar Chavez Day. All the ones that are not officially federal holidays, we should just not recognize, and we should have like days for like Andrew Jackson Day or Patriots Day. I'm pretty sure we already have a Patriots Day. And just do like more patriotic holidays or make a bigger deal around Flag Day. We already have a lot of patriotic holidays, but it could just be recognizing certain great figures. Like an Andrew Jackson Day would be a great one. And insisting, like passing an official presidential proclamation that the United States government only recognizes Columbus Day as Columbus Day, not Indigenous Peoples Day. When it comes to federal holidays, we are not going to make any more federal holidays because Republicans, due to the fact that they love being fiscally minded and everything's about the economy and spending, they don't want to have another holiday. The opposition towards Juneteenth as a holiday had little to do with Juneteenth and what it's meaning outside of the House. There were people like Matt Rosendale who raised the concerns about it as basically they weren't using DEI at the time. They were using CRT. But they were saying that this is CRT, the official holiday for CRT. I don't think we're going to eliminate Juneteenth, unfortunately, under Trump. But you're not going to have any official federal holidays, but there are things we can just refuse to proclaim, like or ignore, like Transgender Visibility Day. And there can be days that we can acknowledge as patriotic holidays, like Andrew Jackson Day and things of that sort. So I think that would be the proper response for Republicans or the next base administration. The next question we have from John. John asks, why are white people excoriated for using the grocery store dividers while checking out? It seems like a pretty convenient tool with no downsides. I haven't experienced this myself. I worked at a grocery store for years when I was in high school and college. I worked at a Kroger. And I actually hated being cashier. I wanted to move around. I hated being in the same spot all day. So I would prefer to either a self-checkout I liked or getting carts because it got me outside not dealing with customers. I don't remember anyone getting upset about it, but I had worked at a very white Kroger, at a white grocery store. So I haven't really seen about this, but I can imagine that some people, even dealing with when we have magical customers, they would just get really offended by random stuff, and they may think it's racist to divide their groceries from your groceries, and they may think of it as a condescending white thing. But it is important. I remember when you didn't have the dividers, sometimes I would scan other people's stuff, and then they would get mad about it. So actually having the dividers was very important for the cashiers. It let you know what was there. You didn't have any disagreements or arguments with it. And when I worked at Kroger, when I worked at the grocery store, everyone there who's shopping would make sure to put a divider after their stuff, because they knew that this was convenient. This kept everything together. And when you didn't have that stuff, then you have these arguments. But I think I can easily understand when, Magic Americans take easy offense at anything, that they would just, flip their shit over like, oh, you think my food is worse than yours. You're trying to divide it. You're trying to signal that this is condescending to me. And so they take these slights as very much as something that's problematic for you. But when you live in a mostly white area, everyone follows the rules and understands the rules are not meant to be slights. They're just made to make everything convenient and organized. And so no one got really upset about it. So I never remember anyone getting upset about it. Actually, people would be like, oh, thank you for dividing it. They'd be like, understand that it's meant to be a useful tool, while I think for a lot of Magic Americans, they would view it as an insult. Now, that's it for all the questions, but I do want to acknowledge New England Refugee. He asked me, he wanted this to be for the mailbag, and he wanted to ask for my views on Plato and Aristotle and who do I prefer. I'd have to read up a little bit more on... He recommended a book. I would probably read this book or another book to give you a full-fleshed answer to that. I don't really have strong opinions on Plato versus Aristotle and their influence on Western thought. So I'd have to do a little bit more reading to freshen my mind up about that and give a better answer on that. So New England Refugee, I recognize your question. I'll either read that book or another book and come back to that for the mailbag, or another time. So just make sure to re-ask that question into the future. So that is it for Highly Respected this week. We are going to have an incredible mailbag episode on Wednesday. I think the new schedule is going to be an article either on Tuesday or Thursday, and then mailbag Wednesday, IQ supplement Friday. This is subject to change depending on the schedule of a week, but for this week, it's going to be, and I'm going to try to keep it as mailbag Wednesday, IQ supplement Friday. So we're going to have a lot more content for you to sign up for at Highly Respected Substack. So hopefully you guys sign up for that. So that is it for this Highly Respected episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and were heavily informed and entertained. We'll have more great content this week, so be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.